Hello, my name is Jito Coleman. I'm the chairman of the Warren Conservation Commission. We made this video to summarize the work we've been doing over the last 2 decades to identify and quantify and map the town's natural heritage features. Let's break that down. Natural heritage refers to the flora and fauna, the whole ecosystem and the geological structures, the sum total of all the elements of biodiversity that has come down to us from past generations that we can bestow on future generations. That's what we mean when we say natural heritage. From planting flowering bushes for pollinators, to keeping space for bears to roam, to protecting our watersheds from erosion and pollution. These are all important aspects of protecting our national heritage. During the 2020 town meeting, it was pointed out to the Conservation Commission that an overview of the town's important natural heritage features, as well as a master plan and the conservation goals, was missing. This presentation will be broken down into a number of pieces presented by the Warren Conservation Commission members and by Hilke, the conservation planner for Vermont Fish and Game. We hope that this presentation will be a stimulus for the townspeople to actively support the Warren conservation goals. Enhancement of our environment can happen 1 square foot at a time, or it can happen in larger parcels. And I encourage all landowners to review this material for insights on how to further enhance the natural heritage resources on their own land. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. And now I'd like to introduce George Schenk, longtime Warren Conservation Commission member, an environmentalist and an entrepreneur, talking about Warren's natural heritage features.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. Like a lot of stories, this is a good news and bad news story. The good news is that Warren is part of an amazing ecosystem. Ecosystems are complex biological communities that require diverse and robust populations of native species. Healthy ecosystems protect air and water quality, provide natural control of pests and diseases, and are so often the places we go to renew our physical and spiritual health. But the world's ecosystems are at an inflection point. Conservation biologists have documented a worldwide decline of plants and animals that threaten how ecosystems function. It has been estimated that since 1970, the world has lost about half of all of its wild animals. Every native species is important to its ecosystem, yet many are in trouble. The current extinction rate has been estimated to be 1,000 times greater than normal. This is not just a problem of distant rainforests and coral reefs. It is happening everywhere. It is happening here, and is happening because of human activity. This does not have to be. With thoughtful consideration and a little effort, we can help protect and enrich the opportunities for wildlife. In doing so, we will enrich the world our children will inherit, and that, perhaps more than anything we can imagine, will enrich our own lives. The town of Warren is committed to protecting its natural heritage. To do so, conservation biologists believe we need to conserve 50% of the land base. This does not mean we have to leave untouched half of our land. Rather, we need a conservation strategy for half. Some will be wilderness, some natural recreation areas, and some the thoughtful management of private land. Wildlife corridors provide varied habitat across the landscape and help connect large blocks of undeveloped land with one another, providing sufficient scale to maintain healthy ecosystems. These corridors are critical to the long-term sustainability of our natural heritage. Wildlife is not just songbirds and bears. It includes the whole range of life, from the smallest soil microorganisms to far-ranging bobcats. Every native species has both a place and a purpose, and all are connected. Helping anyone helps all. I think that the essential truth here is that although nature can seem large and permanent and forever wild, it is not. Nature is in trouble, and the kinds of policies and ideas and patterns of development that have existed for the last 30 or 40 years simply are not sustainable if we are to maintain healthy ecosystems. and healthy ecosystems are essential to maintaining human health. In this way, I think it's important for Warren to reimagine its strategies for conserving its natural heritage. Thank you.
Greetings, I'm Jens Hilke, a conservation biologist with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Today, I wanted to offer a little bit of a sense of the history of the amount of ecological inventory that's happened in Warren since 2009, and also get into a little bit more detail about some of the results of that inventory work. What are the most important natural heritage elements, we'll call them, or the most important parts of the landscape in Warren? So first of all, you should know that in 2008, the town of Warren hired Arrowwood Environmental to do a inventory of town. And this included several different scales. At left, you'll see the contiguous habitat units. Those are basically the forest blocks that were mapped at that time. And there are a lot of different parts of these forest blocks that we'll talk about. At center, you'll see the natural community map, and we'll get into more details on that. And then at right is you see these special habitats, things like wetlands and vernal pools and mast stands, elements like that, rare, threatened, and endangered species. So the Arrowwood inventory gave you a sense at these different scales of what the most important parts of the landscape are in Warren. About that same time, the town of Warren was part of the Forest, Wildlife, and Communities Project. And that was a partnership of a variety, the town of Warren, as well as Waitsfield and Fayston, the conservation commissions, and the Vermont Natural Resources Council, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Vermont Futures Network, and many others. The Forest, Wildlife, Communities Project helped the town in a variety of different ways. Researchers helped doing a build-out analysis, a variety of ecological mapping, as well as community values mapping. And so you can see that for the whole valley, participants drew circles around areas that they care about for different values. And then we put all of those values together and created a single map of these highest priority places from a community values perspective. We then overlap those community values with ecological priorities. And you can really see in that map at right how there's quite a bit of overlap between these most important ecological places and these most important places for community values. Also, as part of the Forest Wildlife Communities Project, the town did a map for ecological conservation focus areas. And this is to help assist the town in any land protection efforts that the Conservation Commission might get into with willing landowners. It essentially shows where you get the most number of ecological principles occurring in the least land area, which is important for land protection goals. The Forest Wildlife Communities Project also helped create a tiered ecological priorities map. And this map, it's not a regulatory map in and of itself, but it was prepared for planning commissions, development review boards, and others to get a sense of how we take these different parts of the landscape, these different natural heritage elements or ecological priorities, and we put them in different tiers that might be appropriate for different regulatory standards or levels of planning. So again, this is not a regulatory map in and of itself. It's just a suggestion on what is most ecologically important, and was a map produced as part of the Forest Wildlife Communities Project. In addition to this work, the town of Warren has contracted for several follow-up inventories. In 2014, the Conservation Commission contracted with Arrowwood Environmental to do wildlife corridor analysis of 5 additional sites involving tracking within the right-of-way and installation of game cameras. Between 2015 and 2017, and another contract was awarded to Arrowwood to do additional corridor conservation inventory and assessment for the so-called top gas parcel. In 2018, the town of Warren contracted for a wildlife corridor analysis, looking at 3 additional crossing areas. And in 2019, the Conservation Commission contracted out for additional research related to corridor regulations. So there's been quite a lot of work done here in Warren over the last 10, 15 years to learn more about what all is in town and what are these most important ecological elements. So with that, I'd just like to shift gears a little bit and think about these heritage elements and just allow me to explain them. So first of all, I just want to think about forest. And where there's forest in Warren are incredibly important opportunities for biological diversity, for wildlife movement, and also for meeting community values like recreation or working landscape, scenic values, community values like the quiet and the scenic beauty. So there's a lot in our forests and the forests in Warren that offer those multiple benefits. From an ecological standpoint, we'll look at the pattern of forests across all of Vermont, and we can rank them in terms of their priority for delivering a variety of ecological services. And so these forest blocks, the concept, are areas of natural cover surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. So in Warren, at left, you can see the 2011 Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department data. We call this habitat blocks. The map you see at left, the blocks are colored by size. So bigger blocks are darker. And so you see the pattern in general sense for Warren of how there are larger forest blocks to the east, to the west, and to the south. Now at right is are the contiguous habitat units included in the Arrowwood Environmental Inventory from 2008. This is essentially the same idea as a habitat block. They were mapped slightly differently, but you can see they're a little bit more accurate than the forest blocks are with respect to how they were delineated using aerial photo interpretation. Overall, the pattern we're looking for is a connected pattern across town where we have these larger habitat blocks that are important for forest condition in deep dark woods that are important for overall biological diversity. Then we have these smaller stepping stone forest blocks that are important connections. And then there are micro connectors like these wildlife road crossings and these streams and surface waters that hold that all together. The concept of natural communities is this idea of an interacting assemblage of plants, animals, and their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. In Warren, there's a wall-to-wall natural community map, both for terrestrial natural communities as well as wetland natural communities. This is incredibly important data. It's much more accurate than other data that exists and the only reason you have it is because of that 2008 Arrowwood inventory. So natural community data is the most appropriate scale for town planning, and it's really fantastic that you have this information. It shows where you have both common forest types like northern hardwood forest and some of your more rare forest types, some of the montane forests up on the ridge lines, and some of the unique wetland natural communities associated with the Mad River. So that's incredibly exciting data. It's also important that we talk about riparian habitats, the stream-side vegetation. And in 2008, those riparian forests were mapped as part of the Arrowwood inventory, and the state continues to map those areas because they're so important to the overall ecological well-being of a community. Again, it's these riparian areas that help connect the larger forest blocks in with the pattern, the network of ponds, rivers, and lakes. So the stream-side vegetation is incredibly important. Wetlands Are another important ecological concept, and you can see at right in the Arrowwood report from 2008, you can see a summary of the different wetland natural communities in Warren and the acreages associated with that. At left, you can see that there's a whole array of functions and values that are important for these ecological hotspots. And so wetlands is another concept that I want to introduce to you as one of the important layers in this layer cake of important ecological elements. Rare species is another element. These are mapped by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department Heritage Inventory, but the 2008 inventory actually did field work on parcels where the landowners allowed that. And so additional field work was done as part of this inventory, and that data was supplied to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. So the Heritage Inventory of Rare, Threatened, and Endangered Species shows you these most important places for these rare species and that type of biological diversity. There are a few rare plants across the town of Warren, and you can see those locations here. Now, I mentioned wildlife road crossings once before in this context of connectivity, of how we want these large forest blocks and these individual wildlife road crossing. You see here a map from elsewhere in Vermont of Route 12. It's just prioritizing that road segment. Well, all of that data has been accumulated for Warren as well. And there are several different priority wildlife road crossings that have been identified. Deer wintering habitat or deer yards is another concept I'd like to introduce to you. These were mapped as part of that 2008 Arrowwood inventory and are mapped by the State Fish and Wildlife Department. These areas are places where there's softwood cover, pines and hemlocks that grow close together that limit the amount of snow. So in the winter, deer are able to go in there and yard up. They're able to move around without exerting as much energy in deep snow as they would outside of that thick softwood cover. So this is a place of refuge for them in those extreme snow events where they can move around without expanding as much energy. And then the last concept I wanted to introduce to you is that of mast stands. A hard mast are species like beech nuts, which provide important food for species like bear and turkey and others. And so these mast stands, these areas of hard mast, are incredibly important sources of food for wildlife. So we can think about these as individual hotspots of biological diversity. We can also put these all together and look at them in the larger ecological pattern. And so if you log on to the BioFinder website, biofinder.vermont.gov, you'll see how all of these fit together into this much larger ecological pattern of what's most important, highest priority and priority for the town of Warren. With that, thank you very much, and please don't hesitate to contact me with additional comments or questions.
Hi there, I'm Kate Wanner, a member of the Warren Conservation Commission for the past 10 years. I'd like to follow up on Jens Hilke's information by discussing the results of the Forest, Wildlife, and Communities analysis specific to Warren and how it can help us prioritize future land protection. This analysis was created as a planning tool for municipal governments in the Mad River Valley that identifies the places ecologists believe are the most important areas for maintaining the valley's fish and wildlife populations and biological diversity. First, let's take a look at what is currently conserved. Once the protection on the south side of Lincoln Peak is complete later this year, we will have approximately 7,800 acres of Green Mountain National Forest in Warren, 268 acres of town land, and 950 acres of private land that is permanently conserved. So approximately 35% of Warren has some level of permanent protection from development and fragmentation. However, are those areas adequately protecting the natural systems and biodiversity of Warren? Let's look at the primary conservation areas as determined by the Forest, Wildlife, and Communities analysis. This is made up of areas with rare, threatened, and endangered species, wetlands and streams with 50-foot buffers, bat hibernacula with 300-foot buffers, all lands over 2,700 feet, which serve as Bicknell's thrush habitat, vernal pools with 100-foot buffer, FEMA's 100-year floodplain, the fluvial erosion hazard zone, rare natural communities, significant wildlife road crossings, and natural lands within a quarter mile of those significant wildlife road crossings. Primary conservation areas are the most fragile and sensitive. If they were developed, it would sacrifice current levels of biological diversity. Development should be avoided in these areas if possible. Luckily, 42% of these areas are already conserved, and another 20% are currently undevelopable under current zoning and regulations. Next, let's look at the secondary conservation areas. Those are made up of early successional habitats, ledges, grassland, a 600-foot buffer around vernal pools, locally significant natural communities, secondary wildlife road crossings, as well as lands with natural cover within a quarter mile of the secondary road crossings. Secondary conservation areas are still very significant ecologically, but are larger areas and hence offer more flexibility in how they can be managed. Small portions of this area can be encroached upon or developed without losing the current ecological functions that these areas offer. Development should be avoided where possible in these areas, and efforts to be made to keep any development to the edges rather than penetrating into the middle of these sensitive areas. 36% of these areas are currently conserved, and another 30% are currently undevelopable under current zoning and regulations. Next, we have tertiary conservation areas, which is simply all the land included in a contiguous habitat unit that is not already covered in primary and secondary conservation areas. 41% of these are conserved, with another 33% undevelopable. Finally, we add in the wildlife corridors as mapped by Arrowwood Environmental. It is recommended to limit development to the outside edge of these corridors and encourage screening, natural color schemes, and other actions to limit negative effects of development in or near these wildlife corridors. Improving the vegetated buffer conditions along the Mad River and its tributaries can also provide protected movement opportunities for wildlife. Corridor study areas are also shown here in darker purple and are areas that have been field verified by Arrowwood, including winter tracking and camera traps in partnership with the Warren Conservation Commission. Basically, to help protect the biodiversity and long-term ecological health of Warren, the Warren Conservation Commission would like to focus future conservation efforts on those primary and secondary areas that are not currently protected from development or fragmentation, with particular focus on our east-west wildlife corridors. We would like to work with willing landowners on permanent conservation of large parcels through additions to the National Forest, conserving strategic parcels as town land, and conserving large farms and large private forest land with conservation easements. The Conservation Commission would also like to provide the tools and encourage willing landowners of any size parcel to take steps to improve your own land for wildlife and biodiversity. For example, I live at the end of a dirt road in a primary conservation area. We would also like to provide the tools and encourage willing landowners of any size parcel to take steps to improve your own land for wildlife and biodiversity. For example, while my property is much too small for permanent conservation, there are many things I can do as a landowner to help biodiversity and ecological functioning, like planting only native plants around my house, especially those that are food sources for bees, birds, and butterflies. I can remove invasive species from my land, keep my lawn small, ban herbicides, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers from my vegetable garden, and make sure my driveway isn't contributing to sedimentation downstream. The Warren Conservation Commission is in the process of putting many resources and ideas up on our website to help give you ideas of what you can do to help maintain biodiversity in our little corner of the world. Thank you for your interest and everything you do to help sustain the long-term ecological health of this beautiful town. Thank you.